Introduce our speaker for today. Welcome to the series, Sarah.
Thanks, Sandra. Hi, everyone. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monifa Vaughn-Cooke, who is an associate professor in the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine in the Department of Health Systems and Implementation Science. Dr. Vaughn-Cooke received her doctorate in industrial engineering from Penn State with a focus on human factors applied to healthcare. She got her master's in industrial systems engineering and her bachelor's in biomedical engineering, both from University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Prior to joining VTC-SOM in 2023, Dr. Vaughn-Cooke held a faculty appointment in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Maryland. She has obviously a wonderfully diverse background in all different kinds of engineering, including human factors and industrial and systems engineering, which creates a unique perspective on how risk is created and then propagated through healthcare systems, and specifically what the design of the system contributes to that potential risk, and ultimately the impact on different stakeholders, patients, clinicians, and others. Dr. Vaughn-Cooke's research aims to identify the underlying behavioral mechanisms that are associated with responding to the risks propagated by those systems. Understanding these associated behaviors allows her to help design user-centered products, things like software, hardware, et cetera, that are specifically designed for those who are vulnerable for use errors. Often, this means exploring individuals at the tails of a normal curve of user needs. She uses a few different methods, specifically behavioral and cognitive modeling of human performance, both qualitative and quantitative data analysis using physiological data as well as perceived state data, and computational modeling of new products to identify design-related sources of error. Her research has been applied to the design of patient self-management technologies to support chronic disease and addiction treatment, to the development of digital design guidelines for high-risk patients with physical and cognitive limitations, and to the design of systems to reduce healthcare provider cognitive workload. She is also a policy fellow in the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, advocating for human-centered design principles in healthcare settings to our policymakers, both in Virginia and at a national level. On a personal note, I have known and admired Monifa's work, her deliberate and thoughtful approach to behavioral modeling for many years. Every time I go to our society meetings, I try and see her talks because I really enjoy how she approaches these problems. I believe her presentation today will address critical challenges in the development of implementable technology for frontline users. So it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monifa Vaughn-Cooke for her iThrive presentation, The Digital Divide, Using Human-Centered Design to Create Inclusive Healthcare Technologies.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate that that introduction, and I think you did a great job of describing the different facets of my research. So as was described, my research focuses on vulnerable populations, heterogeneous populations. I'm going to be talking today about what's called the digital divide, which specifically relates to the health equity implications of implementing technologies in the healthcare system. And I'll talk about some of the human-centered design approaches that I use to create more inclusive healthcare technologies. So as was mentioned, I have a very diverse background in engineering and human factors and ergonomics. My particular perspective on health systems looks at the stakeholders that are involved. So the clinicians, the patients, regulatory agencies, all organizations that might be involved in the care and delivery of management and mitigation of risk within healthcare, and looking at the interactions of those various elements with technologies, with other pieces of information that might be implemented to better understand the state of the patient, and using various computational modeling approaches to describe those stakeholders, and to understand the heterogeneity among them, specifically in the patient population. And then much of that work also leads downstream to simulated human performance studies to better understand in controlled laboratory settings how the implications of certain decisions that are made upstream in terms of clinical decisions, design decisions, and also regulatory decisions. So I'm going to be talking about all of those today. So before I get into that, I wanted to give a bit of a background on the digitization of healthcare, which is very much going to be the focus of the talk today. So many decades ago, as many of you know, healthcare operated very much in silos, both in terms of specialization, but also in terms of information. And so that includes individual healthcare providers. The digital infrastructure did not exist to allow exchange of information. That was largely because of the paper-based nature of information, but also due to the fact of the specializations not communicating with each other, health systems operating as independent organizations. And of course, we've seen some advancement in that, specifically in relation to the digital infrastructure. So now we have much better integration and transfer of information. The Affordable Care Act has propelled and served as a catalyst for a lot of this in terms of interoperability standards and incentivizing for healthcare systems and for providers. We now have platforms, different platforms for the patients to engage in, mobile-based, web-based platforms, and also different mechanisms for storage of patient information and transfer across different health systems. It's not perfect by any means, but it certainly has been advancing in terms of the digital infrastructure. So of course, this has led to a lot of different opportunities for patient engagement. So we have different mechanisms for patients to interact with their own information, to read, for example, lab tests, to get patient education, and all of this in platforms that they can access from home. Things like scheduling appointments at the hands of the patient. And then, of course, different platforms where you can engage with the provider, textual, email, telemedicine. And then most importantly, which is going to be the focus of our of the discussion here today, are patient self-management technologies. So the ability of the patient to manage their condition outside of the direct supervision of the provider. There's a lot more opportunities from the technological standpoint for that to be done. And so this has, of course, expanded the different ways that patients can engage, which is great. That seems like a great opportunity to be provided, potentially to increase patient independence and autonomy, which has been shown to improve patient outcomes when it comes to patient self-management, which is quite relevant for many chronic diseases that the healthcare system is struggling to manage and that patients are struggling to manage. But of course, proper utilization of these technologies requires patients, number one, they have to have the health literacy to actually understand and implement the information that they're receiving. And they also have to have the comfort level with technology, which is really important to actually engage and to take advantage of all these technologies that are at their disposal. And so that becomes problematic in some scenarios because patients may not have the necessary skill set or may not have the necessary tools at their disposal to fully engage. So one question is, who is the patient? So we've talked a bit about what the different engagement mechanisms are for the patient to engage. Now, of course, the designers of these technologies are making the assumption that everyone will engage in the same way and that they all have the same needs. We, of course, know that this is not necessarily the case. That everyone engages with technology in the same way or engages with the healthcare system in the same way. We know that patients are actually quite heterogeneous. They have different needs, different ways that they prefer or require engagement with the health system and different technologies. And so all of this has to be taken into account when designing not only interventions for the patient, but designing technologies. And one of the reasons why this exists is because patients are untrained. So these are not other stakeholders in the health system. These are individuals who there's no entrance requirement to be a patient, no degrees, no certification. So that's what contributes significantly to the heterogeneity. And then you also have individuals who outside of the healthcare system, if left to their own devices, may not have actually opted in to interact with technology in this way. So this is not something they do in their day-to-day lives, engaging with technology. So they're now being forced to engage with technology in the context of healthcare, this safety critical interaction. So that leads to a lot of risk that could potentially be posed if some of these different heterogeneous factors are not taken into account. So one of the factors that's quite important in this context is what is the patient's health literacy? So I mentioned that previously. So this is the ability of the patient to understand and apply health information. And the question is, how do we know what a patient's health literacy is? How do we determine that? So there's several tools that are used for this exact purpose, survey-based tools that can be provided to a patient. For example, this is the short test of functional health literacy in adults, one of these surveys that's recommended by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. So it's a 31-item survey where you have to recognize the insertion of a particular word based on its relevance to the sentence. And then patients are scored, and then they can be placed into, for example, high, medium, low health literacy, and that information can be used for subsequent decisions. Now, several of these tools do exist. However, these are not tools that are actually being utilized by designers. So designers don't have health literacy scores for their population when they're designing for them. Similarly, on the healthcare system side, clinicians do not have this information explicitly stated, for example, in a patient chart. This is not one of the surveys or one of the intake questionnaires that you get when you check into the clinic. So this information, while there is a mechanism to collect it, it's not known for most patients who enter the healthcare system. However, there are variables which we consider surrogate variables for health literacy, things that have been shown to be highly correlated with health literacy, like insurance. So we know that patients who are Medicare and Medicaid patients tend to have lower health literacy compared with patients who are privately insured. We also know that patients who have similarly lower socioeconomic status will have lower health literacy, and racial and ethnic minorities will have lower health literacy. So there's been many studies that have looked at the link between that and other variables which are readily available in a patient's medical record or other easily accessible information. So another variable that's quite important is the digital literacy. So similar to health literacy, this is the ability to understand information and to apply it, but this is on the technological side. So an individual's comfort with the technology will actually influence their ability to adhere to what's being asked of them when engaging with that specifically for health purposes. So one way to look at this is to think of the metaphor of a flip phone versus smartphone. That's a common framework to think of who is digitally literate. So, for example, older adults may prefer flip phones and younger adults may prefer smartphones. While this may be true, that age is a dominant factor here, it's largely an oversimplification, as the factors are a bit more complicated than that. So it's not just your preference or your use of a particular technology, but what are the functions of that technology that you actually utilize? And then even more importantly, how frequently do you utilize those functions? So one of the questions that we've asked previously to actually quantify digital literacy in studies, so how frequently do you browse the web on your mobile phone? So the function is browsing the web, and then how frequently do you do it? Is it just occasionally, or do you do this regularly? So this is the ability to actually seek out information on a web platform on demand. Are you doing this every hour, or is it every few months? Rarely. So this is an indicator of your digital literacy, your ability to access and utilize and apply information regarding a common technology like a cell phone or a laptop. Another aspect of digital literacy is how you actually understand information on how to navigate and use the technology. And there's a lot of assumptions that commonly are made when designing technology, that people understand how to use it, how to navigate it. And so that plays a lot into the design decisions that are made. So you see here a set of common icons. You have the home icon, the menu icon, and a basic button that could serve as a back button, or it could even serve as drop-down functionality. And so the assumption is that everyone will understand the meaning of these icons. No additional information has to be provided. So if you're searching for information on an interface, or you're trying to return to a particular screen, you will naturally understand what these mean, which we know that's not the case. And this is where a lot of patients may get lost when interacting with technology. Another point which tends to be problematic is how to troubleshoot, how to deal with unexpected circumstances when you're interacting with technology. So this is an actual screen from a glucometer when an error message pops up. So it just says ERR. So what would a patient do with that information? If ERR popped up on the screen, how would they proceed? What additional information do they need to gather? And what would they need to do in response to this? Not a lot of information provided. And so this could be a stopping point for many patients. It could be a point of frustration, or you might not be able to successfully interact with the technology or complete a test. So these are just all examples where assumptions are being made about an individual's technological competence or digital literacy that can have downstream implications on treatment outcomes if these technologies are critical for engaging with the healthcare system. So we've established a few of the variables: health literacy, digital literacy. There's also several others that are quite relevant. We have sensory capabilities. So different patients can have visual, auditory, tactile, sensory, high variability in those skill sets. You could have, it could be something as simple as visual acuity, which could be compromised, or you could actually have a disease, an eye disease like cataracts or glaucoma, that could impact how you view information that's being communicated to you through a device. Similarly, that the same is true for auditory communication and tactile capabilities or communication of the device through tactile means. So if a patient has arthritis or diabetic neuropathy, their ability to push a button or swipe a screen is going to be compromised in that particular case. Analytical skills, very similar to health literacy, but also independent to the extent that patients will have inherent analytical skills that vary widely among the population, their ability to think critically and apply that information more broadly. Mobility would also vary widely. Upper body, lower body mobility that may impact how they access healthcare services, but also how they're able to interact and manipulate technology. Interpersonal skills. So this is something that's not commonly thought about when it comes to patients, but of course a patient has to recognize and communicate symptoms to a clinician. They also have to be able to engage in various healthcare settings. It's also true that the interpersonal skills are impactful on the other end of the equation from the clinician side and any other stakeholders who the patient has to interact with. And that can vary widely. Behavioral motivation. So what is the patient's perception of their illness? And what is their, and how does that information then feed downstream into their behavior, their potential to adhere to recommendations, and also what their intrinsic or extrinsic factors are that might influence their ability to perform certain actions. And then socioeconomics are important, not just from the perspective of out-of-pocket costs when it comes to accessing healthcare services, but also applies to accessing technology as well. So all of these factors can create a widening of opportunities and a divide in terms of who's able to access the digital engagement opportunities that are being provided, which complicates already existing health equity concerns. So we know the population is very heterogeneous. We do not want that to then result in some individuals being able to access different technologies and utilize them to their full capabilities, and others not to be able to access and utilize them. So we're going to talk about today some different approaches to actually address this, to capture what is happening in the population in terms of the characteristics of the patient, and then also how we can apply that to lessen this digital divide. So one of the questions that is faced when looking at a highly heterogeneous patient population is resources. So if we know they're heterogeneous and we have to target interventions or technological solutions, how can we do this in a resource effective way? We have to think about the practicality of doing this. It would be resource prohibitive for manufacturers to develop an individual design option for millions of patients who might be in a particular patient population. Similarly, if you're developing interventions, it would also be resource prohibitive on the healthcare system side to do the same thing. So one of the ways to approach this is to think of the patient population in the sense of user groups. So individuals who have similar characteristics being grouped together so that you could then target solutions or interventions at those groups, which lessens some of the resource burden and makes it more practical. Now, this is something that's been acknowledged by the Food and Drug Administration, who's specifically responsible for medical device and technology regulatory approvals. And they've acknowledged that heterogeneity of the population is important to consider, specifically when you are testing the device in the population. which again is required for approval, you must look at a representative of the participants. It must be a representative of the range of characteristics within their user group. And they've also acknowledged that the heterogeneity or homogeneity of user groups can be difficult to establish precisely. And that's essentially where FDA has stopped with defining this difficulty and left it mostly in the hands of the manufacturers and technology vendors to decide how to, one, to identify what these characteristics are, but also how to model them and then integrate that into design decisions. And of course, we know that when these sorts of decisions are left up to companies, there may be prioritization placed on timeline or other resources such as money instead of the safety or the usability of a particular technology. So what's needed is a better way to define user groups that's standardized, that can be applied to manufacturers or even applied at the intervention level to different clinical populations. So one of the questions that arises then is, how do we actually collect data on for populations that we know are heterogeneous? How do we collect data on them and then utilize this information in decisions? So we've talked about a few different ways that patient populations are heterogeneous. The good thing is in healthcare, there's a wealth of information. So you have electronic health records data, you've got public repositories, national repositories that are available. You also have the ability to independently collect data directly from the patient population. So there's a lot of different ways that we can accomplish this to actually quantify data that can then be integrated into decision-making. So once identifying this heterogeneity and the specific elements or characteristics of the population that would influence technology interaction, my particular approach is to identify what's called data-driven patient personas. And so these are statistically meaningful groups of patients that, similar to the user groups, they share common characteristics. And so they can be identified through different computational approaches, which then simplifies some of the targeting or customization of solutions that might be applied to these groups. So here's an example that we did a few years ago. This is an FDA-funded study with data collected at the Howard University Hospital Diabetes Treatment Center. So this is specifically looking at diabetes patient personas related to patient portal use. So they were interested in, they had a National Libraries of Medicine grant that funded the development of a patient portal, and they were concerned that the patients weren't actually using it, and they wanted to understand why. So when we came in, it was specifically to group these patients and to understand what factors were relevant to the patients that impacted their patient portal use, and to try to shed some light on this issue and to also better inform subsequent design iterations of the patient portal. So here's some examples of some of the groups or the clusters that arose from this analysis, and this is just a subset of the groups. So for example, 20% of the population we found, so these were individuals who were in their late 40s, a little bit of college. They had high health literacy and moderate digital literacy. So they were relatively, moderate to low risk in terms of patient groups. They weren't interested in any advanced functionality. So they just wanted basic features like scheduling, for example, and email. But what's interesting about this population is that they have arthritis. That was one of the dominant characteristics of this group. And so there is going to be some interaction limitations, and that would need to be taken into account if the patient would be engaging physically with any system. Another group, a little bit older, more high risk, so low health literacy, low digital literacy, And so again, they're considered higher risk in terms of their interaction and engagement with the system, but they wanted advanced features. So unlike the prior group we just spoke about, they want to have all of the bells and whistles. So they want nutrition support, medication management, but they do not have technological competence that will be considered at a baseline level to facilitate this. So that's an important point, in that they would need to get education supplements or assistance to help facilitate this, which would be the job of the portal or of the clinic who's establishing the portal, to facilitate those patients' interaction with the technology to bring their digital literacy and health literacy up to a level that would be considered competent to interact with the system for these advanced functionalities. And here's an example of another group. So this group is highly educated. They're predominantly graduate school educated, high health literacy, high digital literacy. They want all the features, so everything that a portal might potentially offer, but similar to the first group, they have some limitations. So eye disease. So they want all of these features, which is going to require long interaction times, but they may have, for example, glaucoma or cataracts or a disease that might prohibit them from interacting or engaging with a screen for long periods of time, or reading long passages or text. So for these types of users who want high level of engagement, you might have to investigate things like voiceover or other features that can facilitate this high level of engagement, but also takes into account the fact that they may not be able to interact with textual information in that way. So in terms of the testing of these solutions, so I just showed an example of some of the groupings for a study we did on diabetes patients. So this was part of patient modeling. So the subsequent to modeling a patient, there's a series of steps that would need to be performed to actually test a solution in the population. So you'd want to come up with a use case scenario. So what are the different tasks that a user has to perform when interacting with a system, and then develop a prototype. So this could be software prototypes, hardware prototypes, or some combination to actually test out a design concept, and then going into the patient population to put this into practice in a controlled laboratory study or a simulated use test. And of course, then this would be iterative based on what you learn about usability, timing, accuracy, the variables that are of interest to you. That could then be used to refine the digital prototype and continue testing and refining. So I'm going to go through an example here that walks through some of those steps, specifically for as an extension of the last example, another Food and Drug Administration study, specifically looking at patient self-management technologies. This was a collaboration with the University of Maryland Medical Center. And instead of looking at patients who were active patients in the clinical setting, we actually used a publicly available database, the CDC NHANES database, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is the largest longitudinal data collection in this country for civilians specifically. And it contains a wealth of information about medical data, nutrition, daily activities for hundreds of thousands of patients across the country. And so we're specifically looking at, to demonstrate these concepts, the diabetes subset of the population and the physical and cognitive tasks that will be required for diabetes patient self-management. So any device that they might have to use, grasping, pushing, swiping, any cognitive tasks that might be accompanying that. So making judgments on information that's communicated, any information that has to be retained and held by the patient. in terms of memory. So these are all tasks that would be required, and we wanted to extract those tasks or variables that would be representative of those tasks from the NHANES database. And the goal of this process would then be to have experts, who in this case were internal medicine physicians, to predict the performance of different user groups. So the first thing we did was actually ask the internal medicine physicians, what are the characteristics of patients that inform your predictions every day in the clinical setting? And then we use that to overlay onto the NHANES data to determine what variables existed in the public repository. And so the questions that were asked were given these patient group characteristics and a specific task that may be performed. And there's a wide variety of different tasks that a user might perform when interacting with a technology. What is the likelihood that they will succeed? And this was framed in the context of 100 patients from a particular group with certain characteristics perform a task with these details: low exertion, high exertion, how many will succeed at the task from the perspective of percentiles. And so what this gives us broadly is a generalized form of patient characteristics and their grouping for an entire population that's defined, and their likelihood of succeeding at specific tasks. And that could be used for clinical interventions. It can be used for design decision making. So one of the examples that we used it for in a subsequent study was on design decision making. And this was from specifically the perspective of automation. So automation is thought of as something that is utilized in manufacturing to take more burden off of the human user and to place it onto the machine. So on one end of the spectrum, you can have a fully automated product where all of the functions are performed by the machine. These tend to be more expensive to manufacture and more expensive to maintain. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you can have a fully manual device where the human performs all the physical tasks, all the cognitive tasks, less expensive to manufacture, less expensive to maintain. But of course, if the human population is not able to take on all of those physical or cognitive tasks, that may not be the best decision. So you can start seeing essentially a trade-off emerge between fully automated and then fully manual, with resource burden that might be on the side of the manufacturer, and then the performance of the human on the other side. And so this was the particular viewpoint we looked at specifically in trying to optimize what would be the best way to create product families. And you're probably familiar with product families from a consumer perspective, where you have different aesthetic features or different functional features. So the same can exist when you're trying to balance the needs, the functional needs of a human. So here is a glucometer as an example of one of the devices that would be used by diabetes patients for patient self-management. And we modeled the different functions that would be needed to actually test blood glucose. So as an example, sensing the state of the system functions. And so at any point in time, the system could be reading a biochemical signal. The system could be communicating that information. These are different states. And so either the human would have to sense what state the device was in, or the device would automatically sense that and progress to the next stage. Similarly, another function which tends to be problematic for patients is extracting blood glucose from the body. So one option is to have the patient prick their finger and put it on a test strip, and then put the test strip in this tiny little port on the device. So that's a manual function, but of course, the machine can do this as well. And there's continuous glucometers for certain patients who are eligible for those devices. There's also other innovations like infrared technologies and other sensing-based technologies that have cut the human out of the loop in terms of extracting or transferring the blood glucose to a particular testing platform. So we talked about the modeling and actually understanding more about the patient. And so subsequently, you would want to test these concepts in the patient population. So I just showed a decomposition of the different functions that are involved in a glucometer. So once understanding this, different prototypes of functions could be developed. And so here's an example of the glucometer, some of the controlled laboratory studies that we performed. So I mentioned previously the heterogeneity of visual sensing capabilities. So you can either go into the population to identify the heterogeneous user groups and then stratify them and then enroll them in a controlled laboratory study. That's one option. It's a high resource intensive option. We also looked at this in terms of simulated eye disease. So what you see here on the left are glasses that replicate glaucoma, cataracts, and diabetic retinopathy at different stages, which are the most prevalent eye diseases among diabetes patients, and then perform studies with humans who do not have these specific eye diseases interacting with the devices. This would be something that would be done as a prerequisite to going into the population early on in testing. We also looked at manual manipulation of buttons, something that might be taken for granted if a patient has arthritis or diabetic neuropathy that would impact manual manipulation of a device. So button diameter, button protrusion from the surface in terms of giving tactile response. This is a CAD model that was then 3D printed to perform controlled laboratory tests. And then finally, this all involved actual humans, but this can be done in a virtual sense. So using virtual humans and kinematic modeling to look at things like grasping and one-handed reach of the thumb to press buttons, which is what's demonstrated here. So these are just examples of this, of these technologies being deployed to test different outcomes like usability, satisfaction, ability to successfully complete the task using the glucometer. So a few notes on some of the future directions. So I've talked about some of the capabilities in terms of patient modeling, testing, going into the population to determine how effective your solutions are and the impact of them. Some of this has large implications on customization and understanding more about the population that can be used in interventions and design decision-making. So software features can actually be customized. If you think of user profiles similar to how they're being used in any software tool, those can actually be customized based on these patient groups, where the information that's displayed to you is based on your patient persona. The type and level of digital interactivity, that's also important, specifically from the perspective of, we looked at the example from the data that was collected from Howard University Hospital, where some patients preferred more interaction than others. So why overwhelm a patient with all of the different options they can have if it's going to be overwhelming or undesirable to them? And also remote diagnostic integration. So the level of automation that will be involved with the remote diagnostic integration, the level of feedback that it would provide to the patient, iteratively or dynamic adjustments to their treatment regimen. Another future innovation, which is already being deployed across many healthcare systems, is artificial intelligence automation. This has been looked at from the perspective of chatbots, but I think it has a lot of potential, not necessarily to replace the human decision maker, but to triage prior to a human decision maker coming into the interaction with the patient and the healthcare system. So scheduling, triaging symptoms that might be assessed to better direct the patient towards the resources that they need. So in summary, we talked a lot about heterogeneous user groups and some of the challenges that specifically patients face. So the goal is to aim for inclusive design, specifically by determining who the user is, what are their characteristics, what are their needs, and then what goals they want to accomplish when engaging with the technology so that it's patient-centered. And of course, we want this technology to be used to improve human performance in these settings. And that should be empirically quantified, as we talked about in several examples here today. So I will end there and open up the floor for questions.